This is the video lecture for Chapter 22, Instrumental Music. This is instrumental music in the pre-classic era, focusing specifically on the developments in sonata, in concerto, and most importantly, the development of the symphony, which has become the most important form of large ensemble music in all of Western music history. Symphony developed during this period of time. So, when we talk about instrumental music, we start with the piano. We've already talked a little bit about the piano. The piano was invented in 1700. The harpsichord, the clavichord is the smaller instrument where the strings are struck by brass plates. They continued to be used all the way until the 1800s. People weren't just throwing away their harpsichords and their clavichords, especially if they could not afford to buy a piano. So people continued to play the harpsichord, the clavichord, all the way through until the 1800s. But after its invention in 1700, the piano grew and grew and grew in popularity until it replaced the harpsichord as the most important keyboard instrument by the classical era, the latter part of the 1700s, and of course eventually replaced it entirely. The organ has always maintained its position of importance, primarily of course in church and sacred music. The organ has never gone away. Piano was invented in Florence, Italy by Bartolomeo Cristofori. We've already talked about this. The name piano, it was originally called a forte piano, which translated literally means loud, soft, because this was the first keyboard instrument where you could easily change your dynamics simply by modifying your finger pressure. A lot of times, if people are performing on an early piano, they say they're performing on a forte piano. The term is used to distinguish pianos from the 1700s from pianos from the 1800s. There are several technological developments that happened in the 1800s which really changed the piano for the better. So you can actually hear a clear difference in sound between forte pianos from the 1700s and the modern piano as it began to be developed in the 1800s. Also happening during this period of time is the development of specific chamber ensembles. If you think of the most important chamber ensemble in the Baroque era, it is most likely the trio sonata, two solo soprano instruments with basso continuo accompaniment, so 4 performers. That was the most popular form of chamber music in the Baroque. Eventually, it gets replaced by string ensembles that have no keyboard instrument at all. String ensembles by themselves, duets up through string quintets, but the most important one of these forms is the string quartet. The string quartet made up of 2 violins playing 2 different parts, first violin, second violin playing a lower harmony part, viola, and cello. That's the instrumentation of the standard string quartet, and from its development in the pre-classic era, it's been the most important form of instrumental chamber music, period. Throughout the classical era, the Romantic era, the 20th century, thousands and tens of thousands of composers have written string quartets. This is a fun thing. You probably can't see this picture too well in the lecture, but it's in your text, chapter 22, third picture. This is actually a table, and when you take the top of the table off, 4 music stands fold up, so that 4 string players can sit around this table and they can perform string quartets facing each other. It's kind of like today, someone might have a poker table where it has a top on it, use it as a regular table, and then take the top off, and lo and behold, you can play poker on it. Same kind of thing, but instead of poker, you can play music. So you got 4 music stands, they fold up when you take the top of the table off, fold them down, fold the stands down, put the top of the table back on, bam, you've got yourself a table. Okay, so I've mentioned the piano, the development of the piano, I've mentioned the development of the string quartet. Now I want to focus on what is, with the string quartet, the most important development of the pre-classical era, and that are the modifications. Those are the modifications that happened to the orchestra. So, in the 1700s, orchestras were smaller than today. If you go see the Philadelphia Orchestra today, any orchestra today, you're going to see 40, 50 players at a minimum on stage, all the way up to some really huge pieces written in the 20th century that call for 90 or 100 players. In these days, in the mid part of the 1700s, the orchestra was quite a bit smaller, usually 30 players, give or take. The basso continuo, which has been the heart of the instrumental ensemble all through the Baroque, eventually goes away. People begin to compose music just like they're composing string chamber music without a keyboard instrument. They start composing orchestra, large ensemble music that does not have a continuo as its base. Instead, the orchestra is led by the first violin. Whoever is sitting first chair violin conducted the ensemble. This is before the job of conductor became a full-blown, full-time thing. The position of first chair violinists today actually still has a special role. They're called the concertmaster, and they are the first ranked person in the entire orchestra. They're paid the most, they have the most responsibility, and they have the most power. Out of all the orchestra members, the concertmaster reigns supreme. Or if it's a woman, they're referred to as the concert mistress. They're second only to the conductor in their authority. But in those days, the concertmaster, the leader of the violins, actually was the conductor. They usually led the orchestra from that chair. So, as we go through this period, so now we talked about what people are composing for. They're composing for piano, they're composing for string quartet, they're composing for orchestras, in addition to other things. Many of the genres of music that are happening in the Baroque kind of fall out of fashion. People stop composing, they're considered to be old-fashioned, and instead they modify some of these genres and they invent some new ones. So first of all, preludes, toccatas, fugues, fantasias, and these suites of dances for the keyboard, they all go out of style. People stop composing standalone fugues for the most part. People stop composing preludes, toccatas, fantasias, these improvisatory sounding pieces, and people generally stop composing suites for unaccompanied keyboard instrument or lute or things like that. You know, remember what a suite is. It's a mixture of dance movements. The French suite, the German suite. Sonata, we've already talked about the sonata. We had the Sonata da Camera and the Sonata da Chiesa. Those are for small groups of instrumentalists, usually in multiple movements inspired by dances. That changes. The sonata instead shifts more towards being for one solo instrument with keyboard accompaniment or for a solo keyboard instrument. And instead of being a mix of dance-inspired movements, it standardizes in 3 or 4 movements. Usually if it's 3 movements, the first movement's fast, second movement's slow, third movement's fast again. If it's in 4 movements, the first movement is fast, the second movement is slow, the third movement is kind of a dance-related and triple meter, and the fourth movement is fast again. This becomes pretty standardized. Also, the chamber ensembles usually get named according to the number of instrumentalists, kind of like the trio sonata, although that's 3 lines of music, 4 players, but the string quartet. If I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write a piece of music for string quartet, I'm going to call it string quartet number 1. And then if I write another one, I'm going to call it string quartet number 2. So composers begin to write things that are called string quartet, piano trio, string trio, things like that. Instead of having more generic terms, the names are a little more specific. All right, I think I skipped a slide again. We'll break this stuff down in class. Apparently I didn't skip a slide. The forms of these movements, binary form was still popular. Simple binary form, we've talked about that. A, B. A moving us from the dominant tonic to the dominant, and then B taking us back from the dominant back to the tonic. A and B both repeated, so A, B, B. This is very similar to what was happening in the Baroque. Balanced binary form, where you actually have A, B. However, we're modifying the key structure now. The first part of it, A is in the tonic, moving us to the dominant in B. And then in the second half of it, we have A in the dominant and B in the tonic. That's called balanced binary form. And then rounded binary form, which some people refer to as, they think of a 3-part form as being balanced binary form. The difference is the key structure. We wind up A in the tonic, going to B in the dominant, and then we have a new section where we modulate. it eventually sets us up for sonata form. This modulation takes us back to A in the tonic and B in the tonic. So rounded binary form is kind of the predecessor to what becomes sonata form. Kind of a big A, B, A, only A, the first time, changes keys, usually from the tonic to the dominant, and then when A comes back at the end, it's all in the tonic. This is a fairly detailed breakdown that is in your textbook. I'm not going to get into it right now because we're going to cover this stuff as we talk about the music specifically. But this is a view of these different kind of forms: binary form, three-part form, and then even setting us up into sonata form. All right. Keyboard music. Keyboard music during the pre-classic era, taking us into the classical era. Much of it written with piano in mind, beginning to be written with piano in mind, and some of it just titled keyboard, and you played it on either harpsichord or piano, whatever you had. People begin to write sonatas for keyboard instruments, again, 3 or 4 movements for solo keyboard instrument. Those are considered to be the most challenging to perform and to compose, so it was kind of the high point of what a composer could compose for the keyboard was a sonata. They also began to compose rondos. A rondo is exactly as the form is, A, B, A, C, A, B, A, or some variation on that with the A always returning. So if you wrote something in rondo form for a keyboard instrument, you might simply title it Rondo for Piano, something like that. Themes and variations, another form that becomes popular through this period, where you write a theme and then you write variations on that theme. Each variation changes something about that theme. And then minuets. A minuet is a kind of a light character dance in a triple meter. All of these forms, the rondo, the theme and variations, the minuet, and sonata form, become very important structures. People use them when they're writing their sonatas for solo instrument, their concertos, and eventually in the symphony. One of the most important composers of keyboard instruments, instrumental music, was Domenico Scarlatti. Domenico Scarlatti was the son of Alessandro Scarlatti, who you may remember we talked about when we were talking about Italian music in the mid-Baroque era. Alessandro Scarlatti wrote a lot of vocal music. Domenico Scarlatti, very important for his keyboard music. He wasn't famous during his time. He was not famous while he was alive. His music was eventually kind of rediscovered, and now it's become pretty popular. He wrote 555 keyboard sonatas. That's a lot of keyboard sonatas. 555 sonatas for solo keyboard instrument. 1738, 30 of them were published. However, like I said, he wasn't really popular during his time, but now his music is quite popular. His music is given their catalog numbers by Ralph Kirkpatrick, so unlike an opus number, or in Bach's case a BWV number, Scarlatti's music is identified with a K. That K stands for Kirkpatrick, the man who did the catalog of Scarlatti's music. It's a portrait of Domenico Scarlatti later in his life. This portrait actually reminds me quite a bit of portraits I've seen of Leopold Mozart, but everyone's wearing these powdered wigs at the time. Another very important keyboard composer is Johann Sebastian Bach's son, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. C.P.E. Bach lived from 1714 to 1788. He studied with his father, and he became extremely influential. In the 1700s, C.P.E. Bach was actually more important than J.S. Bach. After his father died, as I've talked about, his music wasn't performed for 75 years. He was more or less forgotten. Certainly his music was not performed regularly in public. C.P.E. Bach was very influential, came up with new forms, new styles, and influenced later composers, including people like Mozart. So, he served in the court of Frederick the Great for a long time, 1740 to 1768. He also was a music director of a very important group of 5 churches in Hamburg, in Germany. His most important music was written for keyboard. It's a picture of C.P. Ebach, portrait of him. You see he actually resembles his father in ways. They both kind of have a wide face. C.P. Ebach wrote a book. We're back to books again, right? He wrote this book, took him almost 10 years, it was published by 1762, called Essay on the True Art of Playing Keyboard Instruments. It's a very important book because this book tells us a lot about the way performance practices from the early classical period, the pre-classic, the way that performers were instructed to perform ornaments and interpret music. A lot of what we know about performing this music today comes from C.P. Ebach's book. Now, there are a couple of different styles of music that are happening during this time. The Empfindsamen style, which C.P. Ebach was very, very well known for. Whoops. Hold that thought, skip the slide. No, I didn't. I'm just missing a slide. I'll go over it in class. The Empfindsamen style is essentially sentimental style. It's a style that utilizes, to some degree, some chromaticism, and it's meant to be played expressively. He kind of established the three-movement pattern for sonatas. Remember we talked about sonatas could be in 4 movements or 3 movements. C.P. Bach's keyboard sonatas were in 3 movements, and this became the primary style. So C.P. Bach was very, very influential in his day, primarily because of the way he wrote expressive keyboard music. Which leads us to orchestral music. We talked about keyboard music, talked a little bit about chamber music, now we're going to talk about orchestral music. The symphony is the most important large ensemble structure that's ever been invented in Western music. Even to this day, if you think about it, a lot of orchestras call themselves symphony orchestras. Or if you go to Boston, you go to a concert in Symphony Hall. What is so important about it? Well, it kind of gives the composers a lot of different options within the structure. It originally developed in Italy. The name comes from the word sinfonia. A sinfonia was an overture written for Italian operas. The typical sinfonia was in 3 parts, fast, slow, fast. So this developed into a 3-movement symphony. First movement being fast, second movement short and slow, and the final movement being fast again, usually in a triple meter using dance rhythms like a jig or a minuet. These were the early symphonies. And if you look at even Haydn, who wrote over 100 symphonies, a lot of his early symphonies are in 3 movements. The first important composer of symphonies was Sammartini, Giovanni Battista Sammartini. He was an important composer in Italy, primarily northern Italy. We're going to listen to, in class, we're going to listen to part of one of his symphonies, the first movement of his Symphonia in F major, 32nd symphony that he composed. It was written for 4 strings, 4-part strings, and we assume probably a harpsichord, a continuo instrument. Again, that's something that goes out of style fairly quickly as we get through this period, but his early symphonies were probably written with keyboard instrument. It's in 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. Very typical of the early symphony. There's Sammartini. However, the symphony really came into its own up in Europe in Mannheim, in Germany. Mannheim was very important because there was an orchestra in Mannheim which was amazing. It was famous all over Europe for the ability of the players, their technique, their discipline, how well they played together. They became very, very famous. The leader of this orchestra and composer was a guy named Johann Stamitz. Stamitz, very important name. When he wrote symphonies for the Mannheim Orchestra, usually wrote in the 4-movement structure, so he popularized the 4-movement symphony, which became standard. Most of Haydn's symphonies, as I said, some of Haydn's early symphonies were 3 movements, but the vast majority of them, I think over 80 of the 100 plus that he wrote are 4 movements. Mozart's symphonies are in 4 movements. Beethoven's symphonies are in 4 movements, although Beethoven actually wrote 1 symphony in 5 movements. Brahms's symphonies, 4 movements. Schubert's symphonies, 4 movements. So the 4-movement structure pretty much dominated symphony writing, and that was popularized by Stamitz with the Mannheim Orchestra. Now, there were 3 musical techniques that were developed in Mannheim, which I think are pretty interesting, and we'll listen to examples of them. We'll hear them in music that was composed by Stamitz, and then later we'll actually find them in music that was composed by later composers such as Mozart. These were given nicknames. Translated into English, there's the Mannheim Rocket. A Mannheim Rocket is a quick ascending arpeggio as part of the melody, usually teamed with a crescendo. So you have this rapid rising arpeggio that is accompanied by a crescendo. This is something that was popularized by composers writing in Mannheim for the Mannheim Orchestra. The Mannheim Roller, we're going to find a great example of the Mannheim Roller in this piece we're going to listen to. The Mannheim Roller is a crescendo that builds over an ostinato. What is an ostinato? Well, an ostinato is a repeating bass line. Not quite like a ground bass. It's usually much shorter than a ground bass. It's more of a short motive or fragment that repeats over and over. So we have an ostinato happening in the bass line, teamed with this crescendo, and on top of that we're going to have a melodic line that is ascending. So these things all together, the rising melodic line and the ostinato on the bass, coupled with a crescendo over a period of a few measures, was nicknamed the Mannheim Roller. It's actually such an interesting and important technique that in the late 20th century, a composer-conductor named Chip Davis founded a group called Mannheim Steamroller. And Mannheim Steamroller obviously took their name from the Mannheim Roller, and they do a really interesting combination of popular music and orchestral music. They've released some Christmas albums, which are incredibly popular. As a matter of fact, when I do Christmas gigs with orchestras, it's very typical for us to play some of Chip Davis's arrangements. So Mannheim Steamroller, late 20th century, still going on today, orchestra that kind of combines classical music and popular music, not to be confused with the Mannheim Roller, which is one of these techniques. And then the grand pause. Grand pause is something that instrumentalists are quite familiar with today, where the music's chugging along, and then suddenly, bam, silence. Usually for a complete measure, in time, and then the music starts up again. Typically in a grand pause, it's not going to be out of time, where you pause for however long you feel like. A grand pause usually stays in whatever tempo and meter you're in. So the Mannheim Rocket, the Mannheim Roller, and the grand pause, 3 things, techniques that composers in Mannheim were writing, which became very popular, very influential throughout all of Western music. Meanwhile, the concerto, what was happening with the concerto? If we think of the Baroque era, concertos, they were either solo concertos, like Vivaldi's violin concertos, or concerto grosso, like Bach's and many others, for small ensemble of instruments with a larger accompanying ensemble, the concertino and the ripieno. Typically, what happens through the pre-classic era is solo concertos. They replace concerto grosso. Now, that's not to say people didn't occasionally write concertos for multiple solo instruments. They did. But the solo concerto far and away becomes the most popular. Popularized during this period by Tartini, an Italian, who wrote 135 violin concertos, although the first concerto that Tartini wrote that was very important was his trumpet concerto. If you're a trumpet player, Michael and Jovan, you might want to look into the Tartini concerto, very important concerto. Here's another Bach. Johann Christian Bach, J.C. Bach, was the youngest son of Johann Sebastian Bach. He's the other one, along with C.P.E. Bach, who became really, really famous. He moved to London when he was in his late 20s, and he stayed in London, so he was nicknamed the London Bach, because there were multiple Bachs making music in Europe at the time. So if you refer to the London Bach, you're talking about Johann Christian Bach, J.C. Bach. He was a composer, he was a performer, he was a teacher, he was an impresario. An impresario can be thought of like today, a producer, concert promoter, someone who kind of does everything, pulls everything together for the final product. He was the first composer in this style to write keyboard concertos for a solo keyboard instrument with the orchestra serving as accompaniment. That was not really done up to this point. So it became very important for his keyboard concertos, and he composed in the other style, the galant style. Remember, the Empfindsam style, the sentimental style, tended to be lyrical and beautiful and very expressive. Well, the galant style was a more modern style, which really set us up for the classical era, with very easy to sing melodies, balanced phrases that made the music very, here's J.C. Bach, Johann Christian Bach, and you can again see the resemblance. If you think of the portraits of Johann Sebastian Bach and C.P.E. Bach, they all had this same heaviness in their facial structure. Oh, going back a minute, just for William, notice he's holding a piece of music. This portrait, actually, this is figure 10 in chapter 22, is actually an homage to the very famous portrait of his father. If you flip back to the chapter on Bach, and you'll see Johann Sebastian Bach holding a piece of music. Well, this pose of his son is almost identical to his father's. In a solo concerto, be it for keyboard instrument, for trumpet, for violin, whatever, we move into a three-movement structure. First movement fast, second movement slow, third movement fast again. And frequently at the ends of the movements we have a cadenza. The cadenza is notated in the music with a fermata. The orchestra plays a chord and then cuts off, and then the soloist performs unaccompanied. In this period of time, the cadenza was almost entirely improvised. Composers did not write out the cadenzas. The performer was expected to improvise a cadenza based on things that had happened earlier in the music, themes they had heard earlier in the music. When the soloist is done improvising their cadenza, they trill. They kind of land on a 5 chord on the dominant. If you're playing a monochromatic instrument, then you'll sit on the dominant and you'll trill. If you're playing a keyboard instrument, you can play the complete dominant chord with a trill over it. This tells the conductor, hey, I'm done improvising. The conductor raises their baton and brings the entire orchestra back in to close out the movement. In addition to the concerto and the symphony, other forms of orchestra music were being developed during this time that served more as background music for parties and dances and things like that. Some of these forms, the divertimento, the cassation, and the serenade, they become very popular forms. As a matter of fact, Mozart wrote quite a few divertimenti and serenades. It's very funny to me because this music was originally written as background music to be played while people were at a party and not necessarily listened closely to, but a lot of this music today is played in concert halls where the audience is expected to sit quietly and listen to the music. Kind of makes me wonder what a party would be like these days if people were playing Mozart serenades in the background, or if in a concert hall everyone was allowed to wander around holding drinks, talking to each other while the orchestra was playing. Remember, in these days, orchestra music was popular music for the wealthy, and so it was used in this way. So, chapter 22. This sets us up for the classical period. The developments that happened during this time, the string quartet, the symphony, the three-movement concerto, the three-movement sonata, these become the dominant instrumental forms from the classical era for about the next 50, 60 years or so, and they continue on to this day. While new forms were developed in the Romantic era, today you'll still find many composers who are writing three-movement concertos, three-movement sonatas, four-movement symphonies, things like that. So that's how important this period becomes. That is going to wrap up this period of the semester. In the spring semester, we will start dead on with the classical period. Obviously, with a couple classes we have left, we're going to do review.